and others that are involved in what's going on there in France. So thank you very much. And we're going to transition now into our next session. I'd like to introduce Gary Rackliffe, who is going to moderate our next session. Gary is a vice president of the newly formed company Hitachi ABB Power Grids. Many of you know Gary from his past work at ABB. This session is titled Bulk Power Enabling a Resilient, High-Penetration Renewables Grid. So, Gary, we look forward to hearing what you have to say as well as the rest of your panel. Thank you very much.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
I hear you, yes. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, yep.
Okay, good. I'm not even going to try the screen share.
Yeah, I know. Your slides were great. I enjoyed them.
Oh, thank you. I know, it's a pity.
Yeah, it's very helpful. We've been looking really closely and talking to some of your, the CAISO folks, trying to understand, you know, some of the events you dealt with. But
hey, Rich and Angelina, just want to let you know that we had lost Gary, and we're just going to bring Gary back up. But we're live right now, and so.
Oh, we are. Okay.
Yeah,
we are. So this is fun.
Welcome.
This is the fun side
Welcome on stage, and we'll work for the next minute or two to get the rest of the speakers and Gary on with you. But thank you. I assume you probably didn't get to join us yesterday for any of the sessions, but we had some really great sessions yesterday. And one of our sessions was focused on transmission. We talked a little bit about the macrogrid initiative that ACOR and others are leading. So, you know, we've had at least an intro to the topic of transmission and bulk power. We also talked a little bit about the challenges with Congressman McNerney from your state, Angelina. We talked a little bit about the challenges of wildfires this year on the West Coast and impacting not only California, but also Oregon and Washington. And I know there's been a call from the governor of Oregon for more investments in the grid in order to mitigate some of the impacts of the wildfires there.
Yes.
So,
and it's happening. They had it in Australia. They had it in Brazil. Our colleagues there had to deal with the same issues. The steps in Russia burned for the first time a couple of years ago too. So we've got fire issues on a global scale.
Yeah. So all we have to do is bury all the transmission, right?
Or, you know, have a network of microgrids too, so you can island out certain areas. I mean, there's lots of solutions.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I kind of think back to a few years ago, I was in a session with then Secretary Chu, and he sort of challenged a group like this of us, and he said, you guys need to show me whether a national grid, you know, with more transmission is the optimal answer, or whether more microgrids and local distribution, you know, optimization is the answer. And of course, the answer is both, right?
Both, exactly. It is both. I mean, NREL, I think NREL came with a study that was very thorough for if you were to achieve 100% renewable energy nationwide. And it requires a backbone grid because you do need to take advantage of time zones and shift resources around. But on the other hand, the benefits of being able to have a more distributed and diversified kind of like microgrid option that also feeds into the larger grid, is not disconnected from the grid for sure, allows you to have the best of all worlds.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know if my screen sharing kind of bumped everybody else.
Well, I think Jonathan was having problems even getting, you know, the chat up. So
we'll figure it out. We've had a few glitches, and Gary, I think they're trying to get Gary on right now. So once he's on, I'll drop off and let him run the discussion with you guys.
We're perfectly happy to chat with you, Steve. That's fine too.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Rich, what's the latest?
We are certainly working on that, and I think Angelina, I know that you had a slide deck that you wanted to get through, and maybe why don't we just start there while we get Gary in. And Steve, if you would like
don't think we can do. I don't think we can do screen share. It's not even allowing me to click on it.
It's okay. I can do it. So Steve, if
you can do it, great.
For just a second, while we get Gary in, I think we'll have Angelina kind of go over the the state of the state for California. And
I should drop off, right? Because you don't have room for everybody.
That would be great. Thank you,
all
Steve.
Right. Thank you all.
And Rich, Jonathan, can you hear me, Rich? It's Jonathan.
Yes, we can. All right, so and you're live.
Yes.
So Angelina, I'm going to share my screen here for you and just.
Great. Why don't you do that? And I'll just tell you when to go to the next slide. By the way, my name is misspelled everywhere.
That is not ideal, but thank you for pointing that out.
That's okay.
How do I make the screen smaller so oh, never mind. So Angelina and Rich, you can hear me also, right?
Yes, and we see you too.
Jonathan,
you see us?
Everyone can hear you, and now you should see a slide deck here, Angelina.
Great, wonderful. So I wanted to put a few slides together because they have a visual of what we're dealing with in California, and that quickly explains the situation. So next slide. Okay, California has a pretty comprehensive set of regulations in terms of which is very helpful in terms of ensuring that we've got a holistic approach to reaching 100% renewable energy and decarbonizing the economy. So we've got the 100% renewable energy by 2020. We've got a very comprehensive set of greenhouse gas targets where the answer at the back of the book is you've got to decarbonize the economy. And because 40% of our emissions are vehicle related, we also have an executive order that mandates no internal combustion engines for sale in California after 2035, which means we need to gear up to beat those goals pretty quickly on the electricity side. We also have a goal that requires all new construction to incorporate solar starting in 2020 for residential buildings, 2025 and 2030 respectively for commercial and industrial. Next slide. So California mandates zero greenhouse gas emissions, as I stated, from electricity by 2045, which means that by 2045, we need an additional 8,500 megawatts of new wind, 75,000 megawatts of new solar, 25,000 megawatts of new behind-the-meter solar, so 100,000 megawatts total of solar, and 55,000 megawatts of new storage. Next slide. We pride ourselves on being renewable energy integrators. Our biggest challenge is the end of the day, the 4 to 9 p.m. hour, where we are coming off of solar, as you see, and we need the support of both imports and the gas industry and the gas fleet to be able to maintain both flexibility and reliable operations of the grid. And that is the challenge with the loss of the once-through cooling plants that's expected to start happening, that we're going to be facing next year. We had a preview of it this year a little bit, but next year, unless we take some serious measures, is going to be a problem as well. And that's an issue for many grid operators dealing with higher penetrations of renewables. Next slide. This is again an example of a typical day of where even though we have a lot of solar, we're over generating, we're even curtailing and exporting energy, it's still challenging to absorb every single kilowatt hour, and it showcases where we've got an operation of wind and solar of about 11,000 megawatts, but meanwhile we're still curtailing energy and exporting out of state, where we curtailed almost 5,000 megawatts of operation. And it can happen in the middle of the day where you've got that generation that needs to be absorbed, and on the other hand, you need flexible resources at the end of the day when solar is going down to be able to meet that peak. Next slide. So the growth of renewables by 2030, where we are achieving our 60% goal, is expected to be largely solar. Next slide. And here's the challenge at the end of the day. Right now, we're dealing with a steady peak of 15,000 megawatts ramp at the end of the day, which by 2030 is expected to become 25,000 megawatts. So for us, flexibility is key, and then things that are able to absorb the overgeneration of renewables, whether that's charging electric vehicles, whether it's desalination, whether it's making hydrogen, or whether it's pushing more energy into the greater West. Next slide. Which is why the energy imbalance market is so important, and it has been so successful. It's a voluntary market, and it now covers about 80% of the Western territories. We're very excited about it. We're working on the day-ahead market as well, which will provide even more capabilities for optimizing the grid. Next slide. And apart from the economic benefits, which are over $1 billion for participants in the energy imbalance market, which again is a voluntary market, people can participate or leave at any point in time. There are also the environmental benefits because of the optimization. The fossil fleet has been some of them have been either retired or some of them are operating less, and we've had a net reduction of CO2 throughout the West of hundreds of thousands of tons of CO2. Next. And it's not a one solution that's going to enable us to operate the grid reliably with a high penetration of renewable energy. We need to focus on storage, on demand response, on time of use rates. The renewable energy fleet needs to be more diversified. It cannot only be solar heavy. We need to be exploring offshore wind, which we are, geothermal, hydro, biomass, and any other resource that can help us. The energy imbalance market, of course, is key. Regional coordination helps a lot, even as we spoke a little bit before, not only on a regional level, but indeed a national level would be helpful as we have stricter and stricter carbon reduction goals nationwide. Electric vehicle integration, the electric vehicle fleet can certainly help the grid or hurt it, depending on how the programs are rolled out. We're hoping that it will be helpful. And flexibility is key. That ramp at the end of the day, when solar is going down, because we're so solar dependent, climbing from 15,000 to 25,000 megawatts by 2030 is going to be key. So apart from having a very strong backbone grid and regional integration, the future is also digitized, decentralized, decarbonized, diversified, and democratized, where we can pull resources from behind the meter and customers in order to support the grid and provide grid services. So thank you very much. This is it. Thank you for sharing.
And thank you, Angelina.
Hopefully this helps.
Absolutely, it does. And we are going to bring in Gary, who has now been able to join us. If he could share his screen and join us. And we've got Jonathan joining us again as well, and Gary. And so, Angelina, thank you for going through those slides. And Gary, thank you for working with us to get back here. And, I'm going to hand this off to Gary, if you can hear me.
I can hear you. Can you hear me now? It doesn't appear the video connection is working, but as long as I can speak, that'll be fine.
I can hear you just fine, and everyone on stage will not be able to see you, but they will be able, or everyone in the audience will be able to hear you. And I appreciate everybody's patience with us as we move through some of these technical issues, but we've got a really good conversation and 45 minutes left and more perspectives to hear from. So thank you, Angelina, for going through the state of the state for California and the major challenges. And Gary, if you would like, I'll hand this off to you. Just to kind of bring us back to the purpose that we're all here for and what we expect to kind of get through the rest of this conversation.
Sure. Thanks, Richie. So I'd like to jump in, apologize for the disruption on the technology. I appreciate Steve giving me the introduction. As he mentioned, I recently joined Hitachi ABB Power Grids when the joint venture was established this past July. I lead market development for utilities and innovation. I've been engaged with the GridWise Alliance for some time, going back actually to the ARRA grid modernization work, and I did serve 2 terms on the board of directors. So in terms of today's session, bulk power enabling a resilient, high penetration renewables grid, I think this topic is very relevant for the GridWise Alliance today for a couple of reasons. First, the renewables. We're seeing increased focus on greenhouse gas emission reduction, and both states and utilities are announcing goals for carbon reduction, many targeting 2050, but as a couple of our panelists will say, some of the goals are more aggressive. The EPA data identifies power generation as the second largest source of carbon emissions behind vehicles. And we are seeing utilities and states make announcements regarding net carbon zero, 100% carbon free, or 100% renewable generation to address the production of carbon from generation. So today, our power generation is about 40% carbon free, meaning we have about 30 years to address the remaining 60% of our generation. We're going to need the high penetration renewables. The second point I want to make in terms of setting the stage for the session is the bulk power system. The renewable energy growth presents grid challenges since renewable energy is weather, time, and location dependent. These challenges include location, involving transmission access, and also the capacity of the transmission grid to move the power from source of generation to the load. Timing, matching generation with demand. Variability related to capacity firming and ability to dispatch. Coordination with other centralized generation resources, and contribution to grid stability, both inertia and available short circuit current. As the penetration of renewables increases, we have seen a saturation effect. So different organizations have been emphasizing the need for transmission, investing in our bulk power system to support the renewable growth. I think Angelina mentioned the NREL SEAMS study. ACOR has announced the macro grid initiative. WIA has announced the need for transmission investment. FERC the FERC staff has submitted a report advocating the need for transmission. And EEI, Phil Moeller yesterday was at an event where he also stressed, again, the need for transmission from the EEI perspective. So the company I work for also is a proponent of transmission investment. We're advocating that electricity and the grid will be the backbone of the entire energy system as we go forward, and that the carbon neutral future is electric. So we're going to need a strong, flexible power system. So the 3 panels today, we have Angelina Galiteva from CAISO. We have Rich Dewey from New York ISO, and Jonathan Weisgall from Berkshire Hathaway Energy. So you've all met Angelina, who went through her opening comments and also had the slide presentation. Just to introduce her fully, Angelina is working to implement cutting-edge energy policies that affect the increasing role of renewable energy, storage, energy efficiency, electric mobility, and distributed energy technologies. She is currently the chair of the CAISO board, the founder and chair of the board for the Renewables 100 Policy Institute, and also serves as a renewable energy expert speaker for the U.S. Department of State. Angelina is an attorney and holds a JD and LLM degrees, specializing in environmental and energy law. Rich Dewey is also on our panel, moving a little bit east from California. Rich is the president and CEO of the New York ISO, which operates New York's transmission network, administers and monitors the wholesale electricity markets, and the plans for the state's energy future. Rich joined the New York ISO in 2000 and has led its market structures, planning, and IT organizations, plus operational roles managing the New York grid, overseeing the New York ISO technology platforms, and managing physical and cybersecurity for the enterprise. He has his engineering bachelor's degree from Clarkson, master's degree in computer engineering from Syracuse, and has completed the Harvard Business School general management program. And then to give us a utility perspective, Jonathan is Vice President for Government Relations for Berkshire Hathaway Energy Company, which is a global provider of energy services that provides electric and natural gas to more than 11.6 million customers worldwide. He joined Cal Energy, a predecessor company, in 1993. He is also an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, where he's taught a seminar on energy issues since 1990 and recently received the Charles Fahey Distinguished Adjunct Professor Award as Outstanding Adjunct Professor of the Year. He also gives guest lectures on energy issues at Stanford Law School and the Johns Hopkins Environmental Science and Policy Program. He serves as the Chairman Emeritus of the Board of Directors for the Center for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Technologies and on the Geothermal Resources Council Policy Committee. And Jonathan has his degrees from the bachelor's degree from Columbia and his law degree from Stanford Law School. So since Angelina's already opened up the discussion, I thought we'd jump to Rich and give us, the New York ISO, New York and Northeast perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Gary. And thanks, Angelina, for those slides leading in. We like to pay close attention to what's going on in California because we view California is in many respects dealing with some of the challenges that New York anticipates seeing in the future. The New York electric system is actually benefits from tremendous amounts of fuel diversity before the push to introduce more renewables and climate change impacting changes to our grid. We've got some good hydro resources. We've got well-performing nuclear resources. But New York State has, like a lot of other states, adopted some very, very aggressive climate policies. With the passage of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the legislature has enacted into law and the governor has signed very specific targets to get to 70% renewable for the power system by 2030, a carbon-free electric system by 2040, and a carbon neutral economy by 2050. So very clearly, the strategy in New York is to aggressively decarbonize the electric system and then use that decarbonized electric system as the engine or the catalyst to reduce the carbon output for the rest of the economy. So it's a very aggressive set of targets. It's a very exciting time. At the New York ISO, we're responsible, as you know, not only for maintaining reliability of the grid, but also the administration of the markets. We support and adopt these goals that New York State has enacted as our own. We are working very aggressively to position the markets as the catalyst or the engine to help us achieve these goals. We view that the markets are the most effective, efficient means to provide resources to the system, but also to lead our grid through this transition. And we look at it very much as a grid in transition. Not to lose sight of the reliability requirements, we start thinking about what the needs of the resources on the grid, the types of attributes that we need. So things like flexibility, things like quick response, quick reaction to the to balance and firm up the intermittency of some of these new renewable resources are going to absolutely be vital. And we're working very hard to make sure that we've got the right kind of market signals in place to incentivize the investment and the development of those resources that are going to enable this transition. So we're very excited about the changes that are going on in the grid. We're excited to be in the middle of it. And I'll just leave it at that. We can turn it over to Jonathan, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Gary.
Great, thanks, Rich. Jonathan, could you give us the utility perspective from Berkshire Hathaway?
Absolutely. Quick IT check. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Terrific. Okay. Well, we started 35 years ago, actually, as a 100% renewable energy company called Cal Energy, just doing geothermal power. We've obviously grown quite a bit, especially since being acquired by Berkshire Hathaway in 2000. We've got 3 U.S. utilities: Mid-American Energy, serving mostly Iowa, NV Energy serving almost all of Nevada, and then Pacificorp, which does business as Pacific Power in California, Oregon, and Washington, and does business as Rocky Mountain Power in parts of Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho. And then we have other assets. We have a BHE Renewables, BHE US Transmission, some gas pipelines, and then companies in Canada and the UK. Overall, we've got about 34,000 miles of transmission lines, all but, 26,000 of which are in the US. And of that 26,000, all but about 4,000 are in the Western Interconnect. We're actually working on two major transmission projects that may be illustrative of some of the issues we want to get into here. One is our Energy Gateway project, 8 separate segments in the West. 4 of those 8 are in service already. One of the stories there is our Gateway South took upwards of 11 years to federally permit, and you can imagine the changes that occurred from the announcement back in 2007 to the beginning of construction just a couple of years ago. So how do you build these? How do you pay for them? Cost allocation, how do you use it? That's an issue for all developers right now in transmission, and the timelines are critical. Another big project we're working on in Nevada with NV Energy, seeking approval for a $2 billion statewide transmission project called GreenLink Nevada, roughly 600 miles of new transmission lines in different segments, but again, expected to deal with the very issues that Angelina and Rich have talked about. Transmission capacity needed in a rapidly growing area, this being northern Nevada, and complying with legislative mandates for higher renewable energy, and actually hoping to reach our own goal of 0 carbon emissions by 2050. And by the way, let's not forget about the jobs that transmissions brings. In the Nevada project, we're looking upwards of 4,000 jobs over 11 years. Our key issues, I look back over some notes at a transmission conference I spoke at about 12 years ago, and unfortunately, the 3 points haven't changed. Number 1, if you love renewables, you better like transmission. Number 2 is that chicken-egg problem, or catch-22. Why build a transmission line if you don't have the renewable energy facilities in place that need it? But if you're a renewable energy developer, why build a facility if there's no transmission line ready for you? And the third point are these long timelines. Angelina, I once joked to you, I think, about how we're going to hire 8th graders for our transmission department so that they can actually see projects finished before they retire. You've heard this, I'm sure, yesterday, and Gary, you alluded to this. New transmission is critical. Really, 3 big reasons: integrating new renewables to connect centers of high renewable resources with centers of high demand. Secondly, adding to system resilience. And third, just taking advantage of the diversity of loads and resources to save customers money and lower greenhouse gas emissions. We've got to improve the business case for more transmission investment. We've got to do that at FERC. We've got to do that in Congress. We've got to do that in the states. We've got, sorry for the landline ringing, that's right near my slide rule and my, well, there we go. We've got to look at streamlining siting and permitting processes. We just need greater certainty, not a guaranteed outcome, just a guaranteed process, firm deadlines, a single agency point of contact. We've got that with gas pipelines with FERC. We don't have that with interstate transmission, electric transmission lines. And also not applying the same, new standards on pending applications, avoiding what I would call the Groundhog Day syndrome of having to change on federal lands guidelines. You start a project and then you've got to incorporate new policies, as we did with sage-grouse issues over that 11 years with Energy Gateway. We've got to recognize the value of increased resilience and lower emissions by regulators. We've got to look at socializing some of the transmission costs, possibly through a federal transmission ITC and investment tax credit. Definitely would be needed for transmission for offshore wind. We ought to look at supersizing new transmission lines, where perhaps in an infrastructure program, the federal government can purchase extra capacity on a new line and then sell that capacity over time as the market demand grows. Possibly revisit backstop siting. You know, FERC's had 4 transmission orders over the last 25 years. I think, what is it, 888, 1000, 2000, can't remember the others, but each made incremental progress in building out a regional transmission infrastructure. But planning regulations now, there's still a large gap between what's being done and what's needed. Order 1000 has not met its promise on interregional transmission planning and development. So there's really a lot to do. We do hope to see major efforts in the Biden administration to support transmission growth through the obvious tie to infrastructure and jobs, and to see some changes, some of which I mentioned, to help support that growth. But let me stop there for purposes of time, because I think we got a little bit late start there, Gary.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jonathan. So I have a few individual questions I'd like to ask each of the panelists. So let me start with you, Angelina. California has had ambitious greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and renewable generation targets, and there's been a shift in the generation mix in the state, as you showed in your slides, moving from thermal generation towards more renewable generation. California is the only state in the top 5 for both solar at number 1 and wind at number 5, showing or reflecting the focus on renewable generation. This summer during the August heat wave, the California power grid was stressed by the extreme high temperatures. There were a number of contributing factors, obviously the extended heat and increase in demand, but also the diminished ability to import power because of the higher than normal temperatures that span the entire western US. So, the flex alerts work to help, decrease the amount of stress. But how can the bulk power system help to address this type of stress on the grid and enable the continued shift towards more renewable generation? And were there any lessons learned regarding the bulk power system, storage, and other facets of the grid during this event?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rich, for the question. I get this question every time, and I'd just like to stress one thing, that the outages we had on the grid side for the California ISO were actually in line with what's expected with the operation of a reliable grid. We had 2 outages, one about a couple of hours, one about 20 minutes, and they basically are something that is expected to occur every 10 years for the operation of a grid. We haven't had anything like that occur in the last 19 years. So this was a first. A lot of the consternation, I think, is also caused by the public safety shutoffs, which are attributed to the grid as well. And those are much more major and longer lasting, but they have nothing to do with reliability. They have to do with fire prevention and making sure that we de-energize a line, a certain line, and that's what the utilities do, not the ISO, in order to prevent a fire from occurring. So I think a little bit of that is rubbing off on grid reliability, and it shouldn't be the case. We also had a 1 in 35 years heat wave across the West, where you had record high temperatures in Las Vegas, and more importantly, Washington and Oregon, along with California, which of course then diminished resources available for export to other areas because everybody needed them to support their own operations. We had an unscheduled outage for some of the facilities that just occurs. It wasn't anything nefarious, it happens, which with thin margins, that of course can also stress the grid. And also some of the capacity in terms of the thermal plants in operation was lowered because of the heat temperatures as well. To my knowledge, it wasn't a grid issue or a capacity issue on the grid. It was just a occurrence in terms of the heat wave affecting the operation of power plants and the resource constriction and unavailability for export, which was the case. But on the grid side, we had a 1 in 10 year event. So when you have a 1 in 35 year events for the heat storm and a 1 in 10 year event on the grid, it means what we're doing is right. We have a resilient grid. We need to be pushing more towards renewables and diversification to ensure that we continue on a path of being able to provide reliable power while we're decarbonizing. So for us, the focus is on imports and ensuring that we have imports at those critical hours, especially the 4 p.m. to the 9 p.m. hour, which is where our evening peak is, and also ensuring that we can harness behind the meter resources to the extent possible and unleash the power of demand energy response and storage to be able to show up at those critical moments. And those are the programs we need to fine tune with markets. And I think ISOs will be focusing on that and figuring out whether we bring it in through aggregation or whether we have individual contracts. FERC has now required that we allow those resources to participate in the wholesale market at 100 kW levels. ISO used to be at 500 kW of aggregation. So we can certainly lower that and hope that they show up, but we certainly need to figure out how to monetize it and allow customer participation from behind the meter to be able to meet that challenge, because we saw 3,000 megawatts show up when we issued the flex alerts. Obviously it's there. We need to be able to operationalize it better, have the transparency, have the visibility, have the dispatchability of these resources, and ensure that we can control them and that storage shows up when we need it to show up. With regards to storage, one thing that we did discover during the operations was that many of the batteries are basically under Rule 21, and they're focused on managing customer demand and demand charges. So at the end of the day, when we need them to show up to support the grid, many of them are depleted and unable to do so. So maybe we have a requirement of a minimum load charge of some form or something that allows those resources to be there when we need them and we can call on them. But we've talked to the providers, we've talked to the technology companies. The technology is there, the capability is there. Now the issues of harmonizing and figuring out how we can work together to to optimize operations across the board.
Great, thank you, Angelina. So exploring a little bit more on the market side, I have the next question is for Rich. So New York State has ambitious greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and renewable generation targets. You have hydro in upstate New York and more even to the north up in Canada if we decide to tap into that to a greater extent. Wind in western New York and upstate New York, a solar initiative, and you have gigawatts of offshore wind that is staged to be developed to the south along the New York coastline. As the market operator, do you see changes in the markets to support the state's clean energy goals? And as the grid operator, how do you see the bulk power system enabling the integration of this renewable generation to achieve these goals?
Sure. Thanks, Gary. Yeah, I think that I look at it as a multi-pronged approach. First, let's talk about the markets. The markets themselves were designed with one specific set of policies in mind, which was delivery of the lowest cost, lowest production cost product using a commodity effect where it didn't matter what the source was. And the policies have generally changed where that clean energy attribute is such an important part of what the objectives are in terms of serving load. So the markets themselves need to evolve, and they are. We're embedding within our markets those types of attributes and those capabilities like flexibility, like quick response, and making sure that investment signal is directed to attract those kind of resources. We've also developed and are working through the policy standpoint, a carbon pricing proposal where we suggested we should put the social cost of carbon into the dispatch to provide that locational signal and provide that very, very sharp investment signal to attract the kind of clean energy resources that are going to be necessary to hit some of these targets. The markets themselves are going to continue to evolve, and we're going to continue to look for ways to make sure that investment signal is attracting the right kind of resources at the right location on the grid. The locational nature of that pricing signal is so critically important to get them to locate in the right spot where they're the most valuable. We also look at it from a transmission standpoint. New York State, we like to look at it and talk about it as a tale of two grids. The upstate portion of the grid is essentially carbon-free most hours of the day today. When you look at the hydro resources, the nuclear resources, and most of the, if not all of the onshore wind is located in the northern and western part of the state. In the southeastern part of the state, New York City and Long Island, it's almost exclusively fossil fuel based today. And we need to be able to improve that transmission infrastructure to get that renewable resources, which is increasingly going to be sited in the northern and western part of New York, to get that power moved down into the city to offset and displace the fossil resources. Jonathan brought up a couple of good points. The New York State electric system curtails wind today at the very modest levels of wind resources that we have on the system. And with so much more that we plan to add over the next 10 years, that's going to increasingly be a problem. I was not in 3rd grade, I was in 8th grade the last time that New York State did a substantive transmission build out. I had curly hair and everything. But the good news is we've made some tremendous progress recently. FERC Order 1000 has underperformed or underdelivered in many parts of the country, but New York State's a poster child for doing it right. We've got 2 projects that were worked through the FERC Order 1000 process. They've gone through their siting. They're set to start construction in a matter of weeks. So, very substantive, meaningful transmission upgrades that will improve the transfer capability from the western part of the state, improve the import capability of hydro resources from Ontario, and deliver more power into New York City. We need to continue to do that. There's tremendous additional amounts of transmission, not only from the backbone, but also from the generation pockets. And when you look at the underlying, not only the bulk system, but the sub-bulk system, there's a lot of energy bottling that's going to take place in the upper part of the state that needs to be solved. I will say New York State has recognized this and identified this capability as important and critical to be able to hit these targets. Some siting, acceleration of siting rules were included within the last legislative budget, so New York State has a fast track process to get through the siting. And the New York Power Authority has aggressively jumped in and identified priority projects really geared towards delivering that renewable power. So I think that it's comforting and refreshing to know that not only are the targets laid out there and codified in the legislation, but also the approach and the strategy and the recognition that transmission is such an important part of that is part of the picture. Our role as a grid operator, not only in terms of maintaining reliability and providing the market signal, we've got a very important planning job that we do. And we have extended and expanded a lot of the planning studies that we do to try to inform the policymakers and inform the markets. We've done a study of what a potential resource mix might look like to achieve the 70% renewables by 2030. That's very achievable. We know how to do that. We can do that with wind, solar, and batteries. And we've identified some scenarios that would make that possible. The more interesting challenge is how do you get to that carbon-free electric system by 2040? And we don't have all the technologies in place to be able to do that. And that's where we've tried to look at, how do we model and examine what sort of economic signals need to be in place to incentivize that private investment, that development, that R&D in a dispatchable zero carbon resource. Angelina mentioned hydrogen. I think that's a promising technology, but needs more development. Renewable natural gas might be a viable solution to that. But these technologies are not ready for prime time today, and we need to think about what are those economic and market signals that we can present, that we can develop to get that kind of investment, to get it sited in the right locations, and to have it deliver on a timeline that's necessary to hit these goals. And that's where we're spending a lot of our time and focus from a planning standpoint now, to really look at those scenarios. And you've got to include, talking about resiliency, you got to include climate change and wildfires and hurricanes and ice storms and those kind of things as you model that, because I think that that's the reality of our future. And Angelina is living it today on the West Coast. And, we're hoping, while we haven't had any wildfires in New York, we got a snowstorm going on today. So maybe that's something that it needs to increasingly be part of our planning studies and part of our analysis. So it's a multi-pronged approach, and they really are all going to have to work if we're going to hit these targets.
Right, and you had asked Gary about storage and the role of storage. There's the dispatchability issue with storage, where you need to ensure that renewables are dispatchable, and you're doing that instantaneous modulation. But also the load shifting and storage is extremely important, and then seasonal storage and how we're going to deal with that as well. So large scale storage and what technologies can provide that. Is it pumped hydro? Is it the hydrogen economy? Is it something else that we don't know yet? But all of these resources with their specific attributes have to be a part of the solution, along with transmission as well.
No, I certainly agree. Rich, before I move to Jonathan, one quick question came in for you, which is what is meant by social cost of carbon? And I wondered if you had a quick answer for that, and then I want to jump to Jonathan.
Sure. Yeah. So what we've done at the New York ISO is we've developed a proposal that what we're offering and suggesting that we need to do to drive the investment level that's necessary is to include within the energy dispatch a social cost of carbon. So if we can agree, that the cost of carbon is X dollars per ton, let's call it $50 extra per ton. What our proposal offers to do is to put that as an adder into the energy offers that suppliers provide, run the dispatch in a way that schedules the cleaner resources first, and then the emitting resources then have to pay back that adder back to the load, or refund back to the load, if you will, inversely proportional to the tons of carbon that they emit. So it's basically allowing the carbon-free resources to keep more of that and to penalize the emitting resources as a means to drive investment in clean energy resources and to ultimately sort of squeeze the high emitting resources out of the market. So there's plenty of information on our website. If you go www.nyiso.com/carbon, there's a whole bunch of case studies and analyses of that proposal.
Okay, great, thank you. Jonathan, I want to move to you with the next question. Berkshire Hathaway Energy launched the energy imbalance market back in 2014 with the CAISO, and now you're working to expand that into an energy day-ahead market. Could you talk about why Berkshire Hathaway headed in this direction? What is the likelihood of a regional West-wide RTO, and are you concerned that the success of the energy imbalance market and the energy day-ahead market might become a de facto RTO and influence efforts to see a full-fledged Western RTO? I know that Angelina talked a little bit about the energy imbalance market in her slides, but I was wondering if you could give your perspective.
Sure. Well, actually, those are three questions. Let me answer them 1, 3, and 2. Why did we head in this direction? And the last would be the likelihood. But let's, we've got Rich on the East Coast and we got Angelina on the West Coast. So let's move to Iowa to start to answer your question, and I will get to your answer. We started developing wind for our customers back in 2004, and several thousand megawatts by 2010, headed to 6,000. And early on, we had a goal. And we're going to reach that goal of producing enough wind energy to meet 100% of our customers' electric usage by the end of next year. Now, as that percentage of wind increased, we realized that we could not accomplish these ambitious renewable energy goals as our own balancing authority. So very early on, we saw the value of joining an RTO, in this case, NYISO, of course, a 15-state commercial market with, I don't know, upwards of about 190,000 megawatts available to trade in real time. So looking at the 38 separate balancing authorities in the West, we took these lessons to California starting in 2012 with then CEO Steve Berberick to talk about the energy imbalance market. And you're right, we were the canaries in the coal mine, launching it with Pacific Corp in 2014 and then NV Energy in 2015. And now, Angelina, I want to say 10 active participants maybe and 11 new ones coming in between now and 2022.
12, yeah.
As huge success, over $1 billion in net benefits. You know what's interesting here? We did this without any legislation whatsoever. These were private sector players coming together with the CAISO, and we filed a tariff at FERC. That was it. Now, these EIM entities, of course, are helping with that oversupply problem that you saw in Angelina's slide, absorbing some of that excess energy, not all. Our fossil plants, of course, are running less because we can't compete against solar. So we're seeing lower prices for our customers. So what's the next drive? It's that EDAM, that energy day ahead market where, hourly trading could add to even more savings. So instead of just optimizing dispatch from 5%, if you will, of the power flows, which is what the energy imbalance market does, just the 15 or hour ahead market. But for day ahead, you're really looking almost at 100%, optimizing your dispatch. Every state west of the Rockies except Wyoming now has a 100% zero emissions mandate, or utilities that have those goals at least. And rising renewable penetrations represent even greater levels of variability. So this energy day ahead market will be even more useful, more beneficial. Now, there's still big challenges, whether it's the energy day ahead market or a West-wide RTO, starting with governance, not to mention transmission charges, and then guarantees, of course, among participants that they're going to meet their obligations. But that's how we got there. Now are we? You look at Angelina's slides at the energy imbalance market, you say, wow, this is working beautifully. And then you think about moving to an energy day ahead market, and you'd say, and your question's a good one. I mean, don't we have a de facto RTO? And isn't this successful drive going to stifle efforts to form an RTO? I think the answer is no. I think certainly the energy imbalance market and the energy day ahead market don't prevent formation of an RTO, but they don't do what an RTO does. I mean, look, the broader the footprint, the more efficient the use of diversified renewables, the better the dispatch. Nobody disagrees with that. Nobody disagrees with the goal of trying to minimize the number of seams and maximizing markets. And you really do need a full regional market to do that. Better cost allocation, get more directly to the benefits. And EDAM doesn't, energy day ahead doesn't solve these problems, much less energy imbalance. You're certainly getting better utilization of the transmission you already have, but you're not making out-of-state diversified renewable energy purchases that a long-term resource adequacy look would give you. I mean, that's what an RTO does. In addition, I mean, regionalization would lead to better transmission planning. You don't have any of that with energy imbalance or EDAM. And I also think that an RTO leads kind of to a better sense of cost allocation. I mean, in the NYISO, for example, the best wind is in the northwest part, but the interconnection costs were allocated to just one utility there. Well, MISO could go to the FERC and assign cost to a broader group of beneficiaries. You can't do that with obviously with the EIM or the EDAM. So those are some of the reasons why I don't think that the success of EIM or EDAM would stop the formation of an RTO, but that kind of leads to your last question, which is the likelihood. Angelina, as you well know, I spent quite a few years going to Sacramento on a regular basis, sitting in the horseshoe with stakeholders, trying to talk about the advantages of greater regionalization. I had not heard and then I spent time in our Pacific Corp states, in Wyoming, Utah, Idaho. I hadn't heard the term Caliphobia before, but yeah. You see that in the other Western states, and of course in California, I think an equally pernicious or equally strong view of we don't want to be held, our feet held to the fire by states like Wyoming that are pursuing different policies. Well, number one, those goals are getting closer. Number two, trust has built up quite a bit, again, without legislation. But we do have to work on forming. It's going to be tough. It's interesting, Gary, you're the other single state ISO in the country, I guess, together with the Cal ISO, but the New York State ISO was not set up by statute. The Cal ISO was set up by statute with a board of directors that is appointed by the governor of California. So you're not going to get to a West-wide RTO if the California governor appoints that board. There've got to be changes. Perhaps you could just make a change in the Federal Power Act simply to require an independent board. It wouldn't be that complicated. But Gary, it's taken a while. I think we're all on the right side of history because broader regionalization, starting with an EIM, continuing with an energy day-ahead market, has resulted in huge benefits, more greenhouse gas emission reductions. Witness a utility like ours simply running our remaining coal plants at minimum loads. And I think resulting in huge savings to customers. We'll see more of that together with the planning that's needed if we can get to that West-wide RTO, which I think is very much needed. And I honestly don't think that these states, including California, whether it's net zero by 2045, whatever the goals are, it's going to be hard to get there without a greater regionalized grid.
Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. You just mentioned one thing that I think is key in terms of the bulk power system in the transmission focus, and that's planning. You know, we struggle in this country to do large scale regional, well, both regional as well as cross country transmission planning, and that's a real gap and challenge for us. We're running out of time at this point. So what I'd like to do is I have a quick question that came in for you, Angelina, which is there any published data on storage not being available or depleted when hoped to be called upon? So I don't know if you've released any information that you can, cite a source for that. And then once you answer,
limited in my slides. Otherwise, I would have added that to the presentation. In terms of what we actually saw, I do have slides that point out. I can send that to you, and you can make it available to answer that question. But yes, we saw that a lot of those resources, those were mostly behind the meter resources that have competing objectives as well. So they were providing load management on the customer side. And when we needed energy, they didn't show up as much as we would have expected them to, because we would have thought they would be more opportunistic, but this did not seem to be the case. So the data that I had surprised me, and it surprised others as well. Happy to share it, and it's something we certainly need to be working on. But with regards very quickly to the EIM, I'm very excited about EDEM. I think we've been able to, because it's a voluntary market, being able to a certain extent deal with the governance issue as well. And I take that very seriously because I am a representative on the governance committee for the EIM and EDEM. And we're trying very hard to make sure that governance is included to allow all of the Western states to feel that they have adequate representation, and that this isn't California bullying folks, but this is a joint effort for all of us to optimize across the board and work together. And I think that EDEM will take us quite a way further. We've had 38 separate balancing authorities in the West for a reason. It's difficult to get past the I want to control my own destiny situation. But I think with the success of EIM and hopefully the success of EDEM, it's going to ease the transition into greater cooperation and regional integration, and ultimately may end up with a regional RTO if we can figure out how to get most of the benefits out of an EDEM or even an EDEM plus, which is something we're talking about as well now. So I don't think it's going to be a immediate change, but it's going to be more of a gradual one-step, two-step, three-step process. That's my sense.
And to go back to Rich's point from earlier, you're doing that with private sector players and markets.
Right.
Legislation's not pushing it. It's a voluntary situation. And if the markets want it, the markets should do it. Yep.
Right.
So Rich, I'm going to let you close out. You have a minute. Any closing thoughts for the panel?
Closing thoughts? No, it's one of the things that that we look at here. And it's funny. I tell all the new people that are coming into work for our company. For 100 years, this was the dullest, most boring industry to get involved in, and now suddenly it is the coolest place to be. It is the most exciting industry. Everything that's going on, whether it's the technology underlying the systems to deliver the performance, the benefits, and the reliability, or whether it's the economics around markets. It's just it's really an exciting time. I think that I like to look at the markets. I like what Jonathan said. The markets got to be they got to lead the way. It's just we're not going to get there through subsidies, government investments. It's going to have to be a market signal. It's going to have to be that private capital investment if we're going to be able to hit these goals. And we're committed to it in New York, and we're excited for it. And it's just an exciting time in the industry right now.
Okay. Well, we're out of time, so I want to thank the three of you for your contributions to the panel today. I think we had a great panel, great topic, and I appreciate your participation today. And with that, I want to turn it back over to Steve. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, let me add my thanks to Gary's as well. And Gary, thank you for moderating such a great session. It's so interesting to hear the different dynamics of what are happening both in New York and California, and of course, with Jonathan in the middle of the country as well. Yesterday, we heard from Alice Jackson at Excel about some of the challenges that we have here in the Rocky Mountain region as well. And so it's pretty interesting to hear the different dynamics that are going on around the country. So with that, we're going to invite